just before we get into the findings, I want to emphasize that this is an interactive webinar. So if you'd like to pose a question, please, you can do so via the text function on the webinar control. You can also raise your hand and I will call on you. So if you look at there's a little icon of a hand with an arrow pointing up, and if you click on that, I will see that and I'll be able to respond to you. Okay, now we'll jump right into the research. As far as the webinar, we've booked off an hour and a half. It would be great if we use the hour and a half, but I imagine we'll probably be wrapped up around 2. I intend to speak for something like a half hour or so, and then want to give a lot of time for questions and any suggestions or or any feedback in general from the audience. So today we'll cover off a bit of an introduction to Quest and this research, specifically this Resilient Pipes and Wires project. We'll talk about the findings with respect to climate change adaptation awareness among energy distributors and the recommendations that we came up with for distributors as well as policymakers. We'll do a quick summary and then open it up to questions. So Quest, Quality Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow. We're a national nonprofit focused on advancing smart energy communities. We've got a number of provincial caucuses across the country, and if you're interested in participating in some of our caucuses, please reach out and I'll make sure that you're connected with the appropriate individual. We're focused on providing support and tools to local government, utility, real estate developers, and other stakeholders to advance the smart energy communities concept. And we also work with all levels of government and industry to create the right framework for smart energy communities to grow. In terms of the smart energy communities concept, what are we after? Why are we doing this? Well, it's really about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, efficiency, improving community resilience, and lowering energy costs. This initiative, the Resilient Pipes and Wires initiative, is really about that third item and the resilience aspect. I'll talk a little bit more about the project scope and what we covered as I continue through. A little bit more about smart energy communities. In terms of how we get there, we've identified 3 areas. One is around integration of conventional energy networks. Second one is the link between energy and land use. And the third is in harnessing local energy opportunities. In terms of this initiative and resilience related to smart energy communities, the resiliency strategy that we're developing as part of our kind of smart energy community concept really is rooted in efficiency, heat management, and local energy sources. And a big part of that is opportunities for integrated systems and distributed energy resources such as combined heat and power, district heating, cooling, and storage and other distributed resources. I should emphasize here that Quest is not alone in identifying these particular items as being important to facilitating a more resilient system. New York's Reforming the Energy Vision describes how customer-side resources can become a primary tool in the planning and operation of the utility system, which will improve system efficiency and enable the deployment of cleaner and more resilient technologies. Just last week, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy published a report that emphasized that energy efficiency increases electric system reliability and resilience. They pointed to the role that energy efficiency can play in reducing electricity system peaks which in turn reduces the amount needed for reserve margin and increases the reliability, resilience, and energy security of the system. So we see some strong voices also drawing a link between energy efficiency, distributed energy resources, and resilience. This initiative is part of a suite of initiatives that Quest is advancing on our part of our research and strategic initiatives. I wanted to highlight a couple other ones. The second one is community energy planning getting to implementation in Canada, and that's a national initiative. And the map there at the bottom right reflects some of the research that we've done looking into community energy plans across Canada and their role in driving the smart energy communities concept. We've also got a CHP consortium that's very active here in Ontario and following the work of similar groups in Saskatchewan and Alberta. I want to highlight these because they link quite closely with the Resilient Pipes and Wires initiative. Okay, so let's get right into the research. We focused on really two objectives. The first was assessing what was the level of adaptation awareness among energy distributors and what kind of actions were they taking. In this context, we're talking about adaptation to climate change and extreme weather events, and we're focused on electricity, natural gas, and thermal energy distributors. So we didn't go upstream to energy production, such as oil and gas production. We did not include bulk energy transmission, either on natural gas transmission or high voltage electricity transmission. And we didn't include non-stationary fuel distributors. So we didn't cover diesel and propane distributed by truck, for example. So the scope also excludes most electricity generation, but we did include distributed energy resources, particularly thermal distribution involving combined heat and power, which is within the scope of this research as it requires energy distributor involvement. The second objective that we focused on was assessing the policy drivers and barriers to the integration of adaptation into the planning and operation of energy distributors. So again, looking at what distributors, what their level of awareness is and what actions they're taking, and then the policy side of things. And we looked at all levels of government, and we also included regulatory, some regulatory research as part of that policy analysis. Again, here are the partners, and thanks again to Natural Resources Canada through the Adaptation platform for funding. In terms of the project overview, why we engage in this project, we're seeing increased frequency, duration, and intensity of extreme weather events, creating issues for customers and creating a public health concern. This is also a big economic issue, and some of the examples that I'll speak to resulted in tens of millions of dollars in costs to customers and the economy. We're talking about resilience as going beyond blue sky reliability. So this is something that one of the pieces of one of the findings from the research was that electricity distributors are permitted to exclude outages that are beyond their control from reliability indicators. So this includes extreme weather events. Excluding these events is problematic because it leaves little incentive for distributors or regulators to calculate or understand how an increase in frequency and duration of extreme weather events will impact service reliability going forward and what customers might be willing to pay to avoid future widespread extended outages. So this was a big driver for us. We're not doing a good job of tracking what resilience looks like beyond that kind of blue sky reliability. We're also taking a broad view of resilience. So this is about withstanding extreme weather and improving recovery from climate-related events. And my next slide goes into a little bit more detail about how we determined what a resilient distributor looks like. We did an extensive literature review, and here I really need to give credit to Sarah, who poured through all kinds of publications. And in the final report, you can see there's over 300 citations for publications. So a trove of information on adaptation. I should actually mention for any of you who are on the line, you can feel free to go to the Quest website. You can download the full report at questcanada.org/RPW. And there's also a summary report there, summary of findings and recommendations. So, sorry, I'm jumping around there. So in terms of resilience, we looked at 4 indicators of resilience, and these were identified in an analysis for the U.S. National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. The 4 indicators they used were robustness, resourcefulness, recovery, and adaptability. So in terms of robustness, do you have business continuity plans and emergency plans in place? Have the distributors used accurate climate forecasting models to identify risks and make sound business planning and infrastructure siting decisions? And are you looking to proactively harden your infrastructure that may be vulnerable to future climate risks? Also, as part of robustness, we looked at complementary sources of distributed energy resources. In terms of the resourcefulness, this is about staff training, equipment, communications protocols, mutual assistance agreements, all in place to respond to widespread outages following an extreme weather event. Recovery, this is about ability to identify outages remotely and dispatch crews to restore outages more rapidly, shifting from SCADA monitoring and control systems to a distributed control system, disconnecting and reconnecting circuits remotely, and looking at customer service improvements to respond quickly during an outage. Adaptability, this is about incorporating learnings from previous outages into future decision making. It's about organizational flexibility to quickly respond to new climate change information, and it's about balancing investments in infrastructure hardening and protection with investments in improving ability to recover from extreme weather events more rapidly. I want to emphasize here that it's important to note that resilience extends beyond infrastructure investments. So especially in the US, you see a lot of discussions around, a lot of talk around hardening, infrastructure hardening, and that's quite a narrow view of resilience. So in our work, we found that resilience must consider the operational response. So resilience is about planning and designing for continuity of operation through a catastrophic event. So this goes way beyond just infrastructure hardening. It includes things like staff management, expectations around communications. So infrastructure hardening is very important, but it's just a piece, one piece of the puzzle. So what did we find in our research? Well, we found that awareness of climate change impacts to the sector is high. This shouldn't be very surprising given the events of the last few years. And in terms of the utilities that we spoke with, the distributors we spoke with, 90% had experienced an extreme event, outage or extreme weather event in the last decade. So a very kind of high impact and awareness. The other side, though, is that awareness of predicted future impacts is quite low. So we're starting to see now models being able to provide more information to local distributors, and not a lot of awareness or connection to those models. So a lot of local distributors are kind of flying blind with respect to what the potential impacts are on their system. The third high-level finding in terms of awareness is that although adaptation is happening in the sector, it's happening in an ad hoc reactive basis. So we see a lot of energy distributors taking action following an extreme weather event, but we don't see a lot of concerted activity among all distributors or within a particular sector to advance. We're seeing some good news, and we're seeing groups like the Canadian Electricity Association, for example, does have an adaptation working group that is looking at developing templates. But only about 57%, I think, was the latest we heard of the Canadian Electricity Association's membership have adaptation plans, for example. So if we know that the intensity, frequency, and duration of extreme weather events is increasing, then what does that say when just under half of the CEA's membership don't have adaptation plans? The fourth finding was that large-scale events are not taken into account with respect to electricity reliability indicators. So when we talk about the electricity sector having a reliability of 99+%, that's not taking into account those types of extreme outages. And at the same time, we see very strong voices like TD Economics saying that $1 invested in resilience can pay back many times over in savings in terms of disaster costs. Now, this is why we also included a strong policy component to this initiative, because $1 invested in resilience, that dollar might be invested by the utilities on behalf of their customers, but not all those dollars are being recouped by the utility. So this requires a policymaker response. In terms of some, I'm going to go through a few examples just to go over what it is that we're talking about now in terms of extreme weather events. So this first one is just a representation that this really needs to include a resiliency response. Really does need to go beyond just infrastructure hardening. So there's a clear health and safety component, communications failures that happen as a result of extreme weather events, and that needs to be taken into account in any distributor adaptation response. This slide is from the 2013 ice storm, and this storm did extensive damage to transformer feeder lines, municipal feeder and service lines. Over 1 million residents were impacted, some for up to 10 days. Almost $12 million in direct damages as a result of this event. And Toronto Hydro directly lost about $1 million in utility revenue. NMAC saw some flooding in 2013 in Calgary, the same year as the ice storm. They saw a temporary loss of access to a substation. Over 35,000 residents, and including a hospital, were impacted for up to 8 days, with just a shade under $10 million in direct damages as a result of that event. The natural gas distribution infrastructure is inherently more reliable and resilient given that it is underground, but it's not immune to extreme weather events. This picture is from in Saskatoon, where Sask Energy's system was damaged, where natural gas supply had to be shut down as a result of a slope failure in 2012. The likely culprit was higher than normal precipitation that led to elevated water table. This is a picture from Charlottetown, where a storm surge in 2000 caused direct damage to a pump house and backup generation facility. Over 80 buildings were impacted. Okay, so now we get to some of the findings that we saw, and this first part of the findings are directed at distributors. So I'm going to go through the 5 categories of adaptation actions and the recommendations that we put forward in the final report. And then in part 2, I'm going to focus on policymakers. So the first category of actions that distributors can take is around adaptation planning and risk assessment. So as I spoke to earlier, we see some energy distributors developing adaptation plans, but this is voluntary. Toronto Hydro is a good example where they partnered with Engineers Canada to pilot a climate change engineering vulnerability assessment, and they developed that in collaboration with field staff, control room staff, engineering, planning department, which really goes through a detailed inventory of their existing infrastructure and facilitates decision-making around investment to look at which parts of the distribution system are most at risk to outages. And this leads us to our first recommendation, which is that electric, natural gas, and thermal distributors have adaptation plans, risk assessments in place using local climate models to better identify risks to the distribution system. I should add here that in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, New York is requiring utilities to develop adaptation plans. We haven't yet seen a response like that in Canada, but I think this is a real opportunity for energy distributors to get ahead of the policymakers. Some distributors have gone so far as to bundle their emergency response plans, their business continuity plans, and their adaptation plans into a single document, recognizing that these plans are highly interdependent and complementary. The second category of actions is infrastructure solutions. These can be organized into a few different categories. This is about improving the robustness of infrastructure, improving distribution system design standards, looking at building redundancy into the distribution system, and also looking at opportunities for distributed energy resources. BC Hydro is a good example of a distributor that is implementing a number of concurrent strategies to prevent future outages. They're looking at incorporating energy storage for peak load shaving, implementing corrosion-resistant hardware, and implementing other technology solutions to improve their resilience. So our second recommendation is that electric, natural gas, and thermal distributors improve the robustness of their infrastructure based on identified future vulnerabilities and integrate resiliency planning, including distributed energy resources, into asset renewal planning. Operational solutions include actions that help distributors track, monitor, and efficiently deliver electricity, natural gas, steam, hot water, and cold water. So these solutions can help distributors detect outages more accurately and reconnect service more rapidly, enhancing resourcefulness, recovery, and adaptability. Some examples are smart meters, weather forecasting and weather pattern prediction systems, predictive asset management programs, and right-of-way management. Our recommendation here, number 3, is that electric, natural gas, and thermal distributors examine opportunities to enhance operations before, during, and after extreme extended outages through enhanced weather forecasting systems, predictive asset management programs, advanced outage management and distribution automation solutions, improved right-of-way management, and smart metering solutions. So this is really, the shorthand for this is really look at opportunities for where technologies can help improve the resilience of your operations. Fourth category is organizational solutions. This includes improving labor force protocols during a widespread outage, as well as improving and documenting response procedures for future generations. These actions can help distributors reduce the time it takes to restore services following extreme weather events and build capacity in organizations to respond more quickly to future widespread outages. The Canadian Gas Association is a really great example of an organization that's moved forward to establish mutual assistance agreements. Following Hurricane Sandy in November 2012, all Canadian gas distributors initiated a process to revise and update mutual aid agreements via the Canadian Gas Association Standing Committee on Operations. The CGA holds this agreement for its members, and the agreement is scheduled to go into effect as of July 1st. Our recommendation here is that electric, natural gas, and thermal distributors clearly define staff roles for before, during, and following an extreme extended outage, including mutual assistance agreements, which include detailed information about crews, spare equipment, and design specifications. Lessons learned are clearly documented to ensure that the processes are well understood and passed on within the organization. Fifth category for distributors includes our communication solutions, and these include actions that improve information sharing during extreme weather events with customers, the public, and key stakeholders. Information sharing can help to enhance the recovery, resourcefulness, and adaptability following an outage. ENMAX is making several changes to the way it communicates with emergency responders and city staff following widespread extended outages in an effort to improve the speed at which reconnections can be made. It will enhance its ability to share geospatial data with the Calgary Emergency Management Agency regarding the status of power reconnections. The City of Calgary has also agreed to provide ENMAX and city staff with enhanced information tools. This leads to our fifth recommendation, that electric, natural gas, and thermal distributors have a communication strategy in place. They are the lead point of communication for stakeholders in the public and have a clear communication process in place to address interdependencies following an extended or widespread outage. So this concludes the first part of our research, where we focused on distributor awareness and actions, and the 5 recommendations that we have for distributors in terms of improving their resilience. The next part of the findings and this webinar will focus on policy and regulatory drivers and barriers. This is a very, it's an illustration of how distribution utilities are, what the oversight looks like in terms of policy and regulatory oversight. It's not perfect, but it was helpful to us in terms of looking at our research and how we should structure the findings. So we'll start with the federal government and our recommendations, and I'll move fairly quickly through this content. There's quite a bit of similarity between our recommendations for federal, provincial, and local governments. I'll focus a little bit more time on the areas where there's a bit of difference and special consideration for various levels of government. So in terms of the federal government, we wanted to highlight that there is a national adaptation strategy. And the federal government has developed this federal sustainability strategy and an adaptation framework which sets out a federal vision and approach to climate adaptation. One of the findings from our research, and we heard this from across Canada from utility executives, was that it would really help the local utility efforts to communicate adaptation efforts if the federal government had more communications around this. So what we heard from distributors was, you know, it's one thing for us to tell our customers that we're doing improvements or making investments to improve resiliency. It's another thing for the federal government to talk about it at a broad kind of strategic level, and that really supports supported their local communications with their customers. So our first recommendation to the federal government is that they enhance their efforts to communicate the relevance of climate change and the associated impacts on the quality of life of Canadians. In terms of Canadian standards and building code requirements, we've found a number of codes and standards where there's an opportunity to maybe make improvements. So one that I'd like to highlight is Canadian Standards Association C282, which is about emergency backup. And there's an opportunity to evolve the current emergency systems and buildings to move, instead of a system where you're evacuating everyone from a building in the case of an outage. If there's nothing wrong with the building, the last thing you want to do is evacuate everyone from the building. So there's an opportunity here to move to a standard that is instead is sustaining occupants more safely during these extreme weather events. For example, using combined heat and power facilities. And the focus of the current standard, again, is to evacuate the building, but it doesn't take into account non-emergency outages into consideration. So our recommendation on this is that the Standards Council of Canada and the National Research Council of Canada lead a review of standards impacting the ability of energy distributors to withstand and recover quickly from outages, and the federal government adopt these updated standards in the National Building Code. Since we released our research, we've been made aware of a number of other standards that are being looked at, and very good to see that in some cases, such as the standards for overhead infrastructure, the Environment Canada climate models are being taken into account directly. So changing weather patterns look like they're going to be having more of an impact on overhead infrastructure in Canada, where previously it was more of an issue just south of the border. So weather patterns are changing, and good to hear that some of the standards are being reviewed in light of those local climate models. In terms of the adaptation platform and knowledge sharing, capacity building, and data collection, we have a couple of recommendations here. One is that the federal government continue to fund the Natural Resources Canada Adaptation Platform Working Group, and that the federal government establish a clear process and identify stakeholders responsible for developing consistent and detailed climate modeling data. So we found that in many cases, distributors were not aware of the adaptation platform and might not be aware that there were models available to them that looked at extreme weather risks or models relevant for their franchise area. In terms of distributed energy resources, this is another area where we saw a strong role for the federal government. And again, I think it's worth emphasizing that TD Economics found that an investment in adaptation yielded quite a big return on investment in terms of future damage avoided. So a couple of recommendations for the federal government. One is that they support projects to enhance the resilience of electric, natural gas, and thermal energy distributors, for example, through matched funding or cost sharing for pilot projects. The other recommendation is that the federal government implement energy systems that enhance the resilience of their operations. These could be conventional energy systems, district energy systems, combined heat and power, or storage, distributed energy resources. So we're calling on the federal government to invest directly. And one of the interesting findings that we found was that the federal government directly owns or controls about 10% of the district energy systems in Canada. So they're already playing a very big role, and we'd like to see them continue and expand their role. In terms of privacy legislation, this is something that keeps coming up. It came up repeatedly in the Resilient Pipes and Wires research that we did, as well as our other work on getting to implementation and community energy planning. It's not clear exactly under what circumstances and how electric, natural gas, and thermal energy distributors can share data with whom. So what we're calling on the federal government to clarify when the distributors can and cannot share, what they can and cannot share, what data they can and cannot share with various organizations such as municipalities under the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. So we're looking for some clarity from the feds on the type of data that can be shared and under what circumstances. So we don't want to violate privacy issues, but at the same time, there is a public health and safety concern here that I think needs to be taken into account. So that concludes the federal portion of our research and recommendations. So I'll move here to the provincial policymaker view. And again, I'll go over very quickly the areas where we see some kind of overlap or a very similar recommendation to what we proposed for the feds. So the first one is around adaptation and climate change plans. And our recommendation here is that provincial and territorial governments enhance provincial adaptation plans to explicitly state the importance of energy distribution system resilience and include direction with respect to critical energy distribution infrastructure. We also have a recommendation with respect to Crown corporations and electricity system operators. We've got them in Alberta and Ontario to conduct a full system risk assessment to support adaptation at the distribution level. We'd also like to see provincial and territorial governments encourage or require local governments to develop community energy plans and also include guidelines for local governments to consider adaptation for critical energy distribution into their local energy planning. An example of this would be Nova Scotia, where all municipalities are required to develop a municipal climate change action plan. And these plans must identify possible climate impact, disaster-prone areas, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and priorities for action. The second category for provincial policymakers is to support distributed energy resources and lead by example. So provincial and territorial governments have a huge role to play in influencing decisions about where and how energy is produced. Provincial energy plans such as the BC Energy Plan and Ontario's Long-Term Energy Plan are two examples of provincial plans which set out strategic priorities regarding distributed energy resources. In some cases, we see policy or regulatory structures that act as a disincentive for the uptake of distributed generation and storage. For example, standby charges designed to enable electricity distributors to cover fixed costs of assets may increase the cost to build and maintain distributed generation projects. So we've got a few recommendations here for provincial and territorial governments. One is that they consider legislative approaches for enabling greater uptake of distributed energy resources. Another is that they review their policies to identify and address disincentives to the uptake of distributed energy resources. Another is that the governments directly support projects to enhance the energy distribution system resilience, again through matched funding or cost sharing. And then the final recommendation here is that they directly invest in systems to improve resilience in their own operations. And terms of technology adoption, we're really looking at the provincial and territorial governments to require or encourage technologies such as smart meters as a way of improving utility operations and strengthening the resilience of the energy distribution system. Now, I know that smart meters haven't been without some controversy, and I think this is really a reflection of some growing pains with the technology and the implementation. But we really see these as a cornerstone of current or future resilience improvements. So smart meters really allow an added level of information and communications technology and making the utilities more responsive. So we've seen several provinces now, including in Ontario, where the Ontario Minister of Energy gave a directive to the Ontario Energy Board to develop an implementation plan to install electricity smart meters for every customer in Ontario, and we've seen that implemented. In terms of emergency management protocols, calling on provincial and territorial governments to play a lead role in defining the role of organizations for emergency management planning and act as a coordinating body among them. Land use planning tools. This is an area where we're starting to see energy creep into land use policy, and we see that as a very positive development. We'd like to see provincial and territorial governments include language related to climate change adaptation and resiliency in land use planning policy frameworks. Building code requirements and design standards. This is mostly a federal government, kind of oversight or influence, but the provincial and territorial governments really do play a strong role, and what we're calling on them to do is encourage standard-setting organizations, industry, and local governments to review standards pertaining to energy distributor resilience. So as far as, and that concludes the provincial policymaker portion. As far as regulators are concerned at the provincial level, it's really the mandate of energy regulators is primarily focused on rate setting, but it's expanded in recent years to include greater emphasis on communications, as well as implementing distributed energy resources and smart grid technologies. So regulators therefore play a critical role in enabling energy distributors to adapt to climate change. Though regulators have expressed an openness to consider proactive investments in resilience and rate applications and have historically approved applications that are not necessarily the lowest cost alternative, there is no obligation or formal process for regulators to take resilience into account when approving or rejecting the applications. There is a lack of clarity under the current structure around what distributors should be including in rate applications. Distributors are also expected to play a lead role as a communicator before, during, and after widespread extended outages. There is a lack of clarity around how much they are expected to communicate and what the role of the regulator is when it comes to communicating expectations associated with rates and reliability to customers. An example of a regulator that is taking action is the Ontario Energy Board, which has introduced a renewed regulatory framework for electricity distributors, moving from a cost of service rate setting framework towards a performance-based regulation rate setting framework. So this performance-based regulation focuses on long-term value for money rather than cost and cost recovery. This approach can support investments in the electricity distribution system that enables utilities to achieve specific outcomes and can result in cost savings for customers compared to the cost of service framework. Now, no regulatory framework is going to be perfect, but we see Ontario moving ahead with this and really leading the way in Canada in terms of moving to this performance-based regulation. So in terms of our recommendation to regulators, is that they make expectations related to infrastructure adaptation explicit and apply rate application rules consistently. Okay, we're going to move now to local governments. And across Canada, municipalities have started incorporating adaptation measures into local plans and policies. With the exception of Nova Scotia, the incorporation of adaptation policies is voluntary. So municipalities are generally not required to complete climate change adaptation plans or risk assessments to identify vulnerabilities and identify policy actions. And when we consider that many local distributors are owned by municipalities, especially here in Ontario, you can see that there's kind of a lack of a driver from the shareholders to the local distributors to actually move forward with adaptation planning. So some examples where municipalities have moved forward with adaptation plans and climate risk assessments. The City of Toronto released Toronto's Future Weather and Climate Driver Study Outcomes Report. This report was developed by Cenis Consulting and includes climate trends and models and is intended to help the city better plan for infrastructure investments. Our recommendation to local governments is that they develop local adaptation plans, floodplain maps, and municipal risk assessments to help local stakeholders, including energy distribution companies, make infrastructure siting decisions. In terms of land use tools and policies, we see, again, lots of language around energy language creeping into land use tools and policies. One good example is the Union of British Columbia Municipalities. They've developed a tree toolkit for communities to help them with to help develop local guidelines that illustrate the importance of coordination among utilities and municipalities to mitigate outages caused from tree species selection and tree branches and roots coming into conflict with distribution infrastructure. Another good example is the City of Sudbury. Their official plan requires the installation of all electricity distribution wires underground in new subdivisions and roads. The cables are buried deep enough to avoid freeze-thaw cycle damage, and they are more resilient to ice or windstorms. So we've got 3 recommendations here for local governments. The first is that they coordinate with energy distributors regarding right-of-way management practices. This includes vegetation management, trimming cycles, tree species, and setback bylaws. Another recommendation is that local governments comprehensively review bylaws to identify opportunities to enhance the resilience of energy distribution systems. Local bylaws and regulations be examined to enable greater uptake of distributed energy resources. Our final recommendation is that local governments implement energy systems, again, both conventional energy systems as well as district energy systems, combined heat and power, that enhance the resilience of their operations. That concludes the findings and recommendations for our research. Our next step, or our next steps, I should say, this webinar, again, the report is available online, the full report, as well as the summary of findings and recommendations. So that is just a shorter version where we've selected some of the recommendations and examples. It's intended as a summary for executives and policymakers. So if you'd like to share it, please do. We plan on further looking at our research at the Quest 2015 conference, which is happening this year, October 26th to 28th in Toronto. And we're looking for opportunities to highlight the research at the conference. And if you're interested, please reach out, and we'll make sure that you're engaged. We're also hoping to do a next phase of the research, and we'd like to further test the findings and recommendations with energy distributors, with policymakers, We'd like to look at the research that's been done beyond Quest's Resilient Pipes and Wires initiative, but look at the suite of research, reports, models, and findings in NRCan's adaptation platform, and try and develop a stronger link between energy distributors and those findings in the adaptation platform. We'd also like to go deeper on the return on investment and quantifying the impacts of adaptation actions for the energy distribution sector. That's our research. Thank you very much for those who advised on the project, especially our association and utility colleagues, as well as Capgemini, who provided space for us to do this research. And thank you to Natural Resources Canada for funding through the adaptation platform. I'd like to now open this up to everyone for any questions, comments, feedback. Would love to hear from you. Was this helpful? So again, there's two ways of doing this. You can either send a comment through text, or you can raise your hand, and then I can unmute you and allow you to speak directly. Hi, James.
Hi.
James Kennedy, go ahead. Everyone can hear you.
Great. I was just picking up on your comments, Richard, about distinguishing between emergency power and sustained occupancy power, specific to CSA C282. And just wondered, I mean, as you're aware, we're aware, there's a lot of interest in that standard or that guideline in Toronto. Just wondering if you're seeing interest in that across the country. Obviously, it's critical for people in multi-unit residential buildings so that they don't have to evacuate the building. They can maintain occupancy in the building because the CSA C282 is largely written around evacuating a building in the event of a fire. Whereas the sustained occupancy idea is about keeping people in a building in the event of an extreme weather event that causes a power outage. So just wondering if you've had any feedback, support, comments outside of Toronto or larger city where there's a higher concentration of multi-unit residential buildings.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, James. And through the CHP consortium and the work of the Alberta and Saskatchewan CHP working groups, I do know that there's interest in that standard and updating that standard. Obviously, it applies to urban centers, so Calgary, Edmonton are another couple of cities that I think would be interested in this. Beyond that, it's a little thin. I know in Saskatchewan, I did raise this with the working group there, and it was of interest. But I think there's only a few buildings in Saskatoon or Regina that this might be a real kind of benefit to. But I'd say kind of broadly, I think it is relevant given the trend for kind of higher intensity in urban centers. So we're a very urbanized population here in Canada, and that trend seems to be continuing. So I'd say that there is increased attention to this. more broadly beyond just Toronto.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Any other questions? Would love to hear from you. Was this helpful? Was this not so helpful? Okay, well, no need to prolong the webinar if there's no other questions or comments. Last chance, going once, going twice. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you participating in the webinar. If you have any comments or feedback you'd like to send directly to me, please, you see my email there. Would love to hear from you. And we can chat about this offline. Thanks very much, everybody.